Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nugentino Cinema. I'm here again today with Kay, and how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So today we're going to review Jeanne Dielman. I say the full title, I have it written down. Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai de Commerce, 1080 Brussels, by Chantal Ackerman. And yeah, so this is like the number one movie on the Sight and Sound film poll now. They had their 2022 edition come out. And so that's gotten a lot of people talking about it, and I've been curious to see it. When did you first originally see this?
I think I would have to check my letterbox diary to remember the exact time. But it was within the last maybe 2 or 3 years that I saw it for the first time. And I'd been wanting to revisit it, so I'm really glad I got this excuse.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and like
Yeah.
I'm glad I got to see it too, because I probably wouldn't if it wasn't for you. I wouldn't have probably watched it ever.
Really?
So I mean,
Even though
maybe I would
wait,
have one
what?
day. Yeah,
Well,
I kind of had like
I'm
an
glad we can
aversion to
chat
it for
about
some
it.
reason.
Oh,
Yeah, for sure.
interesting. Huh, why
Not
is
like
that?
I just had like preconceived notions about like it being too slow or something like that. And I knew it was
Mhm.
very experimental. And it's weird because like I've seen slow cinema before. I've seen like the Brown Bunny. There's long shots in that. I was driving around on a motorcycle like in circles.
Mhm.
I mean I've seen Stalker. I think Stalker isn't directly comparable. There's a lot of stuff going on in that, but it has like slow stuff.
Mhm.
Um but I think the thing that like scared me off with this a little bit is the fact that it's 3 hours and 21 minutes long, and
Mhm.
also that I knew that a lot of it was focused on just like doing chores and like cleaning and like cooking and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I mean, not to spoil too much, but I liked it a lot more than I thought I would, so I can say that
That's
much.
great. Yeah, I'm glad
Yeah.
to hear it. I mean, would you like to share some of your initial thoughts? Because you just watched it for the first time, right?
Yeah, I just watched it
Yeah.
today for the first time.
Oh, wow,
And
just today. Yeah.
yeah, it was just like earlier today, this morning. But
Nice.
yeah, well, first of all, I like that it was broken up into like three chunks. So, I mean, it's each day
Mhm.
basically. And I like the
Mhm.
little interstitial titles, like saying like end of day one and then like end of day
Mhm.
two. And so I like that stuff. There's one thing, I think I'd heard about this because I heard Jay talk about it on Film Junk a little bit. I think it was in his like most recent top 100. And I really like the like light in the dining room, that like just this weird kind of like off-putting light that like is
Mhm.
flashing. And you I think you kind of assume it's like from a neon sign or something like that, like outside the house, but or the apartment. But it gives like a sort of like omnipresent, like suspenseful nature whenever it's present. Like there's something feels off whenever they're like sitting there and eating, or like she's just sitting in the
Mhm.
room and you just see this light going on and off. And I think that comes to a head in the last shot, especially. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so I really like that. But
Yeah. And speaking of the length, I mean, I feel that it is a long movie. There's no denying that. But in terms of, I think what people would probably expect from slow cinema, or a movie of that length is the long shots, especially like you said, when you hear that it's to do with chores, cooking, cleaning, all these kinds of things, you might expect just like having to watch someone mop a floor for 5 minutes.
yeah,
And that's really not the case. I actually really appreciate the way that it edits. So you do have these kind of monotonous moments, but no shot is really, it doesn't linger for too long. I mean, even when it feels a little bit slow, it'll kind of clip to something else. So I feel like even within that length, it kind of keeps things moving relatively well. For me, at least, I didn't feel that the shots were particularly long until the end, and that just adds to like the gravity of what's happening at that point in the film. Did you feel the same way, or do you feel like parts of it maybe dragged or were very long? Did it live up to your expectation in that way?
well, I thought there were long sequences, but there was also like more going on than I thought there would be. There was more conversations and things like that.
Mhm.
And I mean, she has conversations with her son, and they do leave the
Mhm.
house. They go to
Mhm.
like she'll go and get his shoes fixed or something like that, or she'll go to a store.
Mhm.
But one thing I think I was talking about on my podcast with Film Ape, I was saying like, because I was afraid this was gonna be like purely experimental, like there's gonna be nothing to it
Mhm.
other than like an experiment. And
Mhm.
I like experimental cinema, but I usually like it more when there's a kernel of a story in there, and
Mhm.
not necessarily a plot. Like something can be plotless, but like there to be like an
Mhm.
idea or a story in there. And I feel like this did have a
Right.
story. It has an overarching idea to it, so that was good. But yeah, so I wasn't necessarily expecting that at all. I was kind of expecting it just to be someone like living their life, but with no story whatsoever. But there was definitely like a
Right.
concept there, so I was happy about that.
Yeah, and I think that is the most important part because it is an experimental film. It's very loose. The narrative is very loose, but I think that it's not really the point. I think that it ties into the main point of the film, but in my perspective, it's all metaphorical. Like she
Mhm.
is a metaphor for what you would expect of a woman at that time. And I think that a lot of the um, looseness and lack of a direct story or like this is happening at this time, we can expect this to happen. This has already happened. Like in exchange for that, we get something a little bit more abstract and conceptual. And I think that really works for what the film is trying to accomplish. And I I have, like I said, before we started recording, I actually took down some notes, and I'd be happy to jump into stuff, but I know that it might turn into a bit of a tangent. So, is there anything else that you might want to share about like your initial experience with the film before we dive in a little bit deeper?
Well, I have some notes too. I can just take a look at them real quick. Um,
Sure, sure.
I, I thought there was like a nice, and this is like a quick thing, but like I thought there was like a nice ASMR quality to it, for lack of a
Hmm.
better term. But like I could almost see
Yeah.
myself, because the best compliment I can give it is I was dreading watching it. Not dreading it. That's a dramatic way to put it. But I was just like nervous.
Sure, sure.
But the best compliment I can give is that I can see myself watching it again. I wouldn't think I would want to watch it again, but I do want to watch it again. And
Hmm.
um, and I could almost see myself like just watching it at night to like lull myself to sleep,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a very relaxing quality to it, and you get within the rhythm of it. And
Hmm.
uh, and I was watching an interview with Chantal Ackerman, and she was talking
Hmm.
about how like the structure or like the rituals to life, because she grew up in
Hmm.
a very ritualistic family, and
Hmm.
those rituals are to like quell anxiety. So if you don't have even a second to think about like, what am I going to do next, you always know what you're going to do next, then you can't have the anxiety. But then like in this movie, if she wakes up like an hour early, then she has that hour to be anxious and like be like, how do I fill this hour? And you can kind of see that happening in certain scenes. And then towards the end, things start to like kind of like break up, and then there's the ending. But
Hmm.
yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. But I do find it very relaxing, but like at the same time that stuff starts to break away towards the end. But I think that's a cool story structure.
Yeah. If you don't mind my going on a bit of a tangent, the way that I approach viewing this film is from understanding the context of history when it was made. So this was made in 1975 by Chantal Ackerman, as you said, and she had made. She is a feminist filmmaker and had made various films about women's lives and place in society with these big questions about basically what it means to be a woman. So she had this back catalog with all of this investigation into a woman's experience. And then we reach 1975 and she makes this movie. And it's important to understand, at least in the way that I perceive it, how much of it is a response to what's happening at that point in time. So, for example, only about 10 years earlier, um, the Equal Rights Act had been signed by Lyndon B. Johnson saying that like women deserved equal rights to men. And only maybe 2 or 3 years before this was made, like I think it was 72 or 73, the Roe versus Wade case had been or had taken place, saying that women had a right to abortion. So at this point in time, even though this is overseas, not happening in the United States, there's this kind of global shift happening in the women's rights movement where women had been able to achieve certain victories in progress, but then it opened up questions about, now what do we do? Like, now that we have these certain rights affirmed, what do we want our place to be in society? What does it look like now, and what can it look like? And so for me, what she's doing with this film is basically creating this maybe not sandbox is the right word, but basically this image of a woman who fits what would be expected of a woman at that time. Even with the women's rights movement happening, it was still very young, and not many people were on board with it the way that it is so embedded in our culture now. Like, feminist wasn't really a word that people used then, and
Yeah.
it was something that not a lot of people were ready to identify themselves as. And so there was still just this very standard idea of a woman as being a nurturer, a mother, a housekeeper, homemaker, all of these things. And so I feel that what she's doing in this movie is making that. And I think that with the way that she structures it and with the time, it makes a situation where you are forced to sit and look at it. Whereas women, you can look at it and say, like, I identify with this feeling of this is the default option or what is expected for me. And I can't speak to a man's experience, but I think the hope that she had is that you would look at it and see, oh, this is the reality of what women do all day when they're just at home doing, this and that. Like, it's monotonous, it's boring, it feels like so like inhumane in how soulless it is. You're just expected to sit and do these things, and that's your life, and you're supposed to be happy. And so you see over and over and over and over again, in every single instance of her life, it's built around men. Like, she's in service to her son. Before that, it was her husband and son, and everybody says you'd be better off if you got married again. Or her whole life is basically dominated by living in a man's world. And so I think that with this film, she was trying to look at that more directly and unflinchingly. And so that's kind of the way that I approach it, is not necessarily as a direct story, as a form of like full-bodied narrative, but more just like looking at the experience and peeling that apart to see how it damages everybody involved. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. And I could definitely see that in one, like having these repetitive like things that she has to do every day, and then even when she talks to her son, like he says something about, like, if I was a woman, like I would only want to be with somebody who loves me or whatever, and then she's like, well, you're not a woman, so how would you know? And that's definitely like a thematic thing there. And then, like, obviously at the end, and just to talk about the ending for a bit, but
Sure.
I wasn't expecting the ending at all. And then that was obviously, like, she's kind of like fed up, and then there's an explosion that happens. She kills this John, and I have you mentioned, like, she basically is a sex worker. Like, she'll get with a man like once a day or something like that, and that comes to a head at the end. And I think that's like an expression of anger, or for lack of a better word, or however to phrase it, towards I'm trying to think of the right word to use, like patriarchy or whatever. I mean, I don't know if that sounds stupid, but like, just, I thought it was a really cool ending, and I didn't see it coming. And yeah, because really because I don't think when I first watched it, I was really picking up on some of the suspenseful things. And thinking back on it, it makes a lot more sense. But when it happened, it kind of just like happened like instantly, or like it was just like it came out of nowhere. But then thinking back on it, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the ending is very powerful for a variety of reasons. And I think what you said is exactly right. Like it's her, like I said, the whole thing is metaphorical. All we ever know about her is her name and address, really, and that she has a son and is a widow. But the rest of it is very open, and I think that makes it so that a person can see themselves in that position. And I think because it's so loose, we have to assume that like this man that she kills is not really, it's not about him. He's not a character really. He's a placeholder for, like you said, this patriarchal oppression. And I think that the film builds really well to that. And so just to like backtrack really quickly to get to the point about the ending, um,
Mhm.
you had mentioned before too, like very accurately, about routine and structure and the importance of that. And I think that that's part of what makes the film and its duration so important as well, because um, there is a point where you get lulled into this routine and sense of security and, for lack of a better word, autopilot. Like you see her
Mhm.
going through her routine, and like you said, it provides a shield from anxiety. She doesn't have to think about what she's actually experiencing or feeling. The feelings of isolation, we constantly see her isolated. um, but she doesn't have to deal with that because she always has something to do. And so for the first 2 days in this 3-day film, we see her going through this routine. We get to know, what she does daily and how those things define who she is. And then on the final day, it's all just a little bit off. And like you said, she gets up before her alarm. She drops a scrub brush. But even the day before that, she had like overcooked the potatoes. And it's these things where it broke her out of her routine enough to where she wasn't allowed to be, not allowed, but wasn't able to be on autopilot. And she really had to be checked in and thinking about and experiencing what was happening to her. So in those moments of frustration, it pulls her out of this sort of like haze of domestic routine and makes her actually look at what's happening. And I think what's so powerful about the final day too is, you may have noticed there's all different camera angles. So for the first 2 days, we see the rooms and the hallways and the streets from the same camera angles over and over again. Like the bedroom is one angle, the kitchen is one angle, everything is from a set space. And in the third day, everything is askew. So we don't really see the rooms from the same perspective. In fact, we see everything from a different perspective. And we see her like manipulating different objects, like she goes and dusts different things. She makes coffee twice because it doesn't taste quite right. And so she's forced to be outside of her routine in a way that makes her hyper aware of what her life actually is. And I think that in the final bit, at that climax where, um, after she has had intercourse with this guy, which we don't see and are made to assume is in pleasurable or just very like mundane, like it's a chore for her like anything else. Like she doesn't enjoy it. She lays a towel down. It's very methodical. Um, we see her literally, very literally, under the oppression of a man. And it's, again, it's not meant to be seen as anything but symbolic. Like you could look at it and say like, oh, she could just push him off, but the point is that she can't
Well, I was
because
gonna say it felt like she kept trying to and then she couldn't. So that was a yeah, I definitely noticed
exactly.
that.
Yeah, and so it's
Hmm.
not that she didn't necessarily have the physical bodily strength, but there were so many other forces pushing on her. Like she didn't scream, she didn't try to do anything. It's just this feeling. And so after that, her action of killing him makes sense because she's finally in this position where she's able to see what her life has become and the way that she's been oppressed. And so she kills this guy. And I think, for me at least, there's no other way that the film could have really ended. Like it provided such a huge catharsis in that metaphor. um because especially too, like with the way that women are so constantly murdered and attacked and like made victims in films, like it would be so common to watch a thriller and see a woman after sex be, killed in bed. Like these are things we're so accustomed to. But at that time, you wouldn't really ever see the same thing happen to a man. Even still in modern cinema, you wouldn't see that happen to a man. So I feel like there's a catharsis within the film for Jeanne in killing this guy and killing the symbol of her oppression. But I think also as a viewer and lover of film, seeing that role shifted was very cathartic. And so it's like the whole thing has to build to that. And then for me, it feels like the only real way that it could have ended.
Yeah, for sure. And I thought it was a cool feeling to have you kind of just exist in this space for so much of the movie, and a lot of the same things happening. But like I said, things breaking up. But then to have like such a dark turn, I thought it created a really
Mhm.
cool tone. And yeah, I thought it was a great
Yeah.
ending.
Yeah, it's
But
really startling.
yeah, for sure. And one small criticism, this doesn't even really matter, but I thought like in terms of like a budget thing, like it didn't
Mhm.
even look like you could see like the scissors go into his neck. Like it just was like it just kind of she kind of like held it there and then like walked away, and I didn't even see
Yeah.
any blood on him. He was kind of just going like oh, but I don't know. But it was funny.
Yeah. And then yeah, you only really see like a little bit of blood on her hand and her shirt.
Mhm.
And then like you were saying, like the light comes back through in this really wonderful way. And I think that that's also symbolic of the way that you just don't even notice something, like how you can have a clock ticking in your house and after a few days you just don't hear it tick anymore. And it's like this
Yeah.
light is flashing in her house all the time, possibly symbolic of whatever experience you want to tie to that light, or what you want it to symbolize, but it's always there. And then at the end, she's just sitting there like bathed in that light. Like it's the only real visual action happening in that scene. And so yeah, I feel like it works really well. And then just having this blood there and just sitting there, um, it like almost moved me to tears, to be honest. It was like
Yeah.
I got like a very strange sense of like relief or like solidarity from it. It's a little bit hard to explain, I think. But I thought
I
it
can
was such a
understand for sure.
yeah, yeah, and
And it's
it's
kind of a
interesting.
transcendental movie, like almost like meditative. And
Yeah.
in the beginning, like one thing that I thought about when you're talking about that is at the beginning you see her
Mhm.
bathing, kind of
Yeah.
starts doesn't start in the very beginning, but like towards the beginning, and then at
Mhm.
the end you because you were just saying bathing in the light, but
Mhm.
like you see that kind of like washing away something, like I don't know
Yeah.
metaphorically, like I don't know, like her soul has been affected, and like the light kind of represents that, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I could see there being I don't know if I can put into perfect words, but there being some sort of metaphor about like the light washing away something. But yeah, I thought it was a great last shot. Hmm.
Yeah, and it's one of the few times in the film where we see her doing nothing. And I think that that's an important element of it too. And on that, like in the third day, because we see her always performing some action, always working on something. She's never quite sitting still. Or if she is, she's knitting or reading or waiting for potatoes to boil or something. Like she's always doing some action. And one of the only other times we see her not doing anything is also in day 3 when she's like sitting in this lounge chair, which we've never seen her do before. And I remember in that moment too, like you start to see this shift in her psyche. But for me, I was just like, wow, she blends in with the furniture. Like she's so a part of this house that she just like is almost literally a part of it. Like she just fits there. And she's not
Hmm.
like separate from it really. She just blends in with the furniture. And I thought that that was really powerful. But yeah, there's so many small details to the film that I think can be overlooked. And I say that because I had overlooked them the first time I saw them, and maybe it's just age or time or a little bit different perspective on it now. But there were things like the fact that you never like see her having a conversation with another woman aside from when she's like purchasing something in a store, and then it's strictly transactional. But the only other time she interacts with women are when she's watching the one neighbor's baby. And in that scene, the other woman is very specifically out of the shot. She's like blocked by the door wall, and you hear her
Mm.
voice, but you don't ever see her. And then the
Yeah, I
only other
remember
woman
that.
she has communication with is like her sister or her aunt, I think, in Canada, who writes a letter, and she doesn't even really talk to her. She just reads this letter aloud. And otherwise, she's completely isolated from really any sort of interactions with people aside from her son and the few people she purchases things from. And then her
I think
son
there was
doesn't.
one scene,
Mhm.
or sorry, I think there was like one
No.
scene where she was talking to somebody like in a park, not in a park, like in a square or like around stores, but it was like outside. And there's somebody, I don't know if it was a woman, maybe I'm wrong. I thought it was a woman, but she like asks her if she can like, I think it was like a friend or something from the past, and she was like, do you want to go get coffee or something like that? And then she was like, sorry, I
Oh,
can't. And
yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot about that part. You're right.
I don't know if you see her though. I don't know if you see her face. So it could still be like what you're saying, like how in the one part, the person who's dropping off her baby, you see her, you don't see her, but she's like outside the door. So it could be a
Mhm.
similar thing to that, where they're cutting her off. But I can't remember exactly if you see her face or not in that scene. But that's the only other time I can think of.
Yeah, it's just this like very insistent theme of her being isolated. And then there are these great moments with her son in the evening. You touched on one on the night of the first day where her son, says, if I were a woman, I would do things this way. And she says, but you're not a woman, so you could never understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really powerful. And then in the second night, he has the conversation with her about sex, and he says, a man's penis is a sword. And so there's like that whole conversation. And so it's like she's having these very like deep kind of like there's potential to have these deep conversations with her son, but like he doesn't really quite know how to communicate with her, and she doesn't really know the same. And then there's the social taboo of not touching on certain topics. Like on the
Mm-hmm.
second night, she's like, oh, that's not something you need to worry about, go to sleep, and just kind of wraps up
Yeah.
the conversation that way. But then there are like during the daytime, I remember on the third day, her son comes in and she's like very clearly not okay. And his first thing that he says, the only thing that he says is, your hair is a mess. And so it's like there's this disconnect between like him wanting to get this sort of like intimate understanding about life from his mom, and his mom being dis- disconnected because of the social taboo of talking about those things, and so them both like missing each other. And it's like they're just constantly quiet, and it just furthers the isolation. So it's just like in every moment, even if there's not something like necessarily happening in terms of action, there's all of these other things that are being seeded.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the idea that you can be isolated in a house where you live with other people. I
Hmm.
think that happens a lot within families.
Yeah.
Not in all families, but a lot of families. And because you're set into each person has their own set of things they have to do each day, and you kind
Hmm.
of just get stuck in that cycle. And especially with like a mother son relationship or something like that, and like you said, there's certain things you don't touch on, so they kind of just they don't communicate the best, even though it's just them in that apartment together.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, you like it is interesting how you can just be completely separated, even if you do live with other people. Like even if it's like five people, people can be
Yeah.
separated within their own little worlds and their own little rooms or whatever it may be. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenging and sad thing. Like I remember too, I think it's the second day where they're waiting for the potatoes to cook all of the way, and she's like, no reading at the table and all of that. And so they have this little window of time where they're just forced to sit with each other and wait. And like he doesn't know what to do, so he immediately starts reading again. And she tries to make a conversation, but all she can talk about is like how the potatoes would be better mashed, or I forget what the exact line is, but she just like, they just struggle. And it's also, again, like metaphorical of like how we, like you said, we're forced into these roles, or we have these expectations put upon us of what we need to do each day. And his whole thing is going to school and being, learning all the stuff that she's helping him with, and she has her own responsibilities. And they're chosen for us by society and the roles that we're given. And then it's just like, it harms both parties. It harms the son because he's trying to make these connections and doesn't know how, and probably feels isolated himself. And then it harms her too. So I feel that it's excellent in that way too, because it obviously focuses on a woman's experience, but it doesn't discount the way that men are harmed by the patriarchy as well, in subtle ways.
Yeah, for sure. And it's all like a ladder. Like you have like all these people at the top, and like for women, it's like it's a patriarchy, so it's set up where it's slanted towards men, but then you have all these men that are underneath too. There's like all these people on top, and like I don't know. It is interesting to just look at like the. But it is interesting to look at as just like a breaking apart of like a certain system, and so. Yeah, I wasn't necessarily expecting that from the movie, but yeah, it's definitely something that's there. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was definitely interesting.
It comes as an interesting contribution to that wave of cinema at the time too, because I think it was 66, correct me if I'm wrong, that Bergman did Persona. It was, I think, late 60s. So
yeah,
like
I think
you
66.
Yeah. So there's Persona, which is very much encapsulating and trying to deconstruct the female experience, but Bergman does it in a much more abstract way. And then you have this in 75, and then just a couple years later, Agnes Varda makes One Sings, the Other Doesn't. And she is also, of course, a prolific feminist filmmaker at the time. So it's like you kind of see it as a point in the arc of feminist filmmaking as a response to the time. So I think it's interesting there too, where it takes a very different approach than a lot of other films. And again, I think that it was bold even just in showing a mundane woman's life on the screen. I can imagine at the time when it was released, how people would maybe be surprised to even see that on the silver screen at all, to be like, okay, I'm gonna sit here and watch this woman make potatoes. Why does this matter? And so I think that it was very like maverick in that way as well, and very kind of shifting of perspective in cinema. And I think that that's part of why I'm so glad it was #1 on Sight and Sound, because it with everything that's happened this year alone. I mean, I mentioned the Roe versus Wade decision that was made in 73 that was just undone this year. And so I feel like the choice to put this at the top of the Sight and Sound list is using it as a tool again to remind people of like, you want to backtrack. Is this what you want to backtrack to? Like, are these really the roles and assumptions and situations that you want to impose on a person again? Like, is this what we really want? And so I think that like putting it in the spotlight again is really significant in that way, and super powerful. I mean, I know that it's not the most capital E entertaining film of all time, but it's extremely poignant and timely, even though it's so many years old.
Yeah, it's cool that she felt so free to kind of just do whatever she felt like she needed to do. Like, because I think it'd be a lot easier to swallow if it was like 90 minutes. Because if it was 90 minutes, I might not necessarily even hesitate to watch it, because I could be like, I can get through 90 minutes. But there's such a massive length to it. But it makes a lot of like I feel like each segment's 3 days, and basically each day is about an hour. So I think it makes a lot of sense. But, yeah.
And then it makes you think like, okay, well, I have to sit through 3 hours of this woman doing these mundane things, but how many women experience that every single fucking day for their entire life, and they're just supposed to be okay with that. Like, that's part of the point too, where it's like, oh, it's a chore to watch somebody do these things for a few hours. Imagine that being your entire life and all you have to look forward to. And it's just a struggle. And I think it's important too to look at the fact that it's not just men who are putting her in this position, but other women too. Like the letter she gets, which is just like, you'd be happier if you got married again, or when she says, oh, getting married was just the thing to do. It's at the time it was very self-imposed because there weren't a lot of other options realistically to consider, and so it was just like the way that it was. And so yeah, I think it was very, very bold to just show that and say, like, this is the reality, this is what you've been asking and putting women through. So the least you can do is sit for 2 hours and suck it up.
Yeah, for sure.
So it feels a little bit like, sticking it to them in that, and then at the end, of course, sticking it to the man in a
Yeah.
very visceral way. So yeah, there's so many little details in the film that work so well to its favor. And I'm just really glad that it's getting attention again, because I think it deserves it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely an
Yeah.
interest. It's a good pick for number one. And one scene a lot of people point out is the kneading of the meat for the meatloaf.
Huh.
And this is just random, but there's something weirdly hypnotic about that. How like there's this meat, and then like she breaks the egg on it, or there's an egg on top, and you see her like pouring like cheese onto it and just making this like weird meatloaf. But yeah, you see her make all kinds of different meals throughout the whole course of the movie. There's like soup. Trying to think of what else, but there's always like a specific meal. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, she has a schedule. She has a schedule for every day of the week. She knows what dinner is going to be on each night. Like, I think she's like,
Yeah,
oh, it's Wednesday, which means that it's breaded veal with peas and carrots, or like it's like a roast
yeah.
with potatoes on Fridays. Um, yeah, I know what you mean about like the hypnotic elements of some things, but I would wonder why like that scene in particular is what stands out to people. I guess it
Well, I
is
don't know.
kind
It's
of
just
though.
even like looking at Letterboxd, I hear a lot of people like bring up the meatloaf scene, and I was
Huh.
watching some like Criterion Channel's features on it, and like there's people bringing up the meatloaf scene in that. It seems to always
Interesting.
be the scene that people point to, and I'm not totally sure why, but I
Huh.
did find it like weirdly hypnotic, so that could be the case. Like it's just like everybody just hypnotized by that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember that scene. I don't feel like I didn't particularly gain any double significance from it, or anything like that. But yeah, there were a lot of moments like that that feel very very therapeutic. Like, I remember even just like there are some scenes of her getting dressed, and like the way that she folds a shirt and stuff is just like very precise. Everything she does is very precise. And so yeah, but the meatloaf too, it's very methodical.
Yeah.
Methodical kneading of the meat. That's so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I
it's
I think I was thinking a lot about like ASMR stuff like that because I was almost going
yeah.
into it expecting something like Leviathan or something like that. Not
Hmm.
expecting that, but like just looking at it from that angle. So like
Okay.
just kind of like I don't know how to explain it, but just like watching like letting this like process like wash over me. But I wasn't expecting the story stuff so much.
Mhm.
And while I did realize that this stuff started to become clear to me, I would still like to go back and rewatch it to notice the subtle things, like the way things start to break apart, or the way she starts to forget things, or because I think a lot of that stuff went over my head. But yeah, so I definitely would like to rewatch it.
Yeah, I feel like the overall concept is like she embodies this ideal woman. She embodies what we would expect the ideal woman of the time to be. She is very precise, she's thrifty, she's smart, she isn't too talkative, she's maternal, she is a good cook, a good housekeeper. She's like all of these things, right? And so in the final day, in the final act, when she is experiencing difficulty in maintaining those things, and we see that she's not perfect, that she's not able to like do this thing exactly right every single day. Sometimes you just overcook the potatoes. Sometimes you just drop the scrub brush. Sometimes you're just a human being. It breaks her out of this role and gives her the freedom to like be a person. And when that happens, she's like, okay, this is not what I want from my life. And basically burns her entire life to the ground through the killing of this guy. If you want to take it literally, you know, it's like she's giving up everything she had, but then when you think about it, it's like, what does she really have that's for her? It's all for everybody else. And then there's the metaphorical approach, which I think is more accurate. But yeah,
I think it works in both ways.
Yeah, and that's part of what makes it so successful too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the metaphorical approach is probably the more important one, but I think if you want to look at it as like just like kind of like a basic like literal thing, you can. But
if you
there
just
is
want to
like a
take it
lot
at face
underneath it.
value.
Mm-hmm. But like looking at it at face value, there is still meaning to it, so that's why I think it works. But like, yeah, but there is a lot more to dig into if you need to. So that's definitely a cool thing.
Yeah, I think that that's the approach that I had the first time I saw it, is I just took it for exactly as it was, what it was. And I was just like, I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, oh, yep, eventually the lights outside her window is, you know, they're gonna be police lights. And like that was kind of my mindset, and just kind of considering it from a very literal perspective. Yeah. And that makes sense because, you know, it is this real thing that she's experiencing. But yeah, it's, I like that there's different ways of approaching it because they're all valid and tie into the same overall idea. So yeah, I think it's just a very successful film. I gave it 5 stars the first time I watched it, and I would easily give it 5 stars again now. I can't see myself giving it anything less. But I understand, you know, different structures work for different people. And so, you know, if it doesn't necessarily land for somebody the same way, I think that's equally fair and makes sense. But for me, I think it's a really powerful film, and works well and achieves what it set out to do.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen Chantal Ackerman's other movie, News from Home?
I haven't seen News from Home yet. I wanted to watch it before this chat, but I have just been too busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just curious because I had a friend who was like really into that movie, and he recommended it to me. And then this is probably like 4 or 5 years ago, but I watched like 10 minutes of it, and then I just said like, I'm sorry, I can't watch this. Like I just can't because it was like slow. I wasn't trying to be like mean or anything, but I was just like, I don't know, I wasn't into it. But
Fair enough.
but I would like to go back to it now, having watched this, because I think I'll be more prepared for what it is. And that's only like 80 something minutes, so it's not anywhere near as much of a commitment as this is. But it's interesting. It's like it's I think it's a female character, and she's walking through the subways in New York, and she's getting letters back from her mother. So as she wanders around New York, you get these letters from her mother that are being read throughout. So I'd like to go back and watch that. There is like similar stuff in this movie. There's the letters that are read in this as well. But yeah, I'd like to watch that. I'd like to watch Chantal Ackerman's debut feature that I was reading about. I forget what it was called, but it sounded interesting. And yeah, but it was definitely a good watch.
Yeah, I want to dig through her filmography a lot more too, because I feel like she just has so much to say, and she has a way of saying things very creatively and pointedly. So I could definitely see myself enjoying a lot more of her films. I just have to watch them first.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think as a lover of Varda too, and that kind of response, not maybe response to new wave, but response to the way women were being treated in film at the time is interesting as well. So yeah, they're the French juggernauts that I would praise before others, but that's just me.
Yeah.
Teach
I think
their
that's all I
own.
had to. I think
Yeah.
that's all I had to bring up.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me. There's always a billion details in a film this long that we could pick through, but I think that's about all I had to say.
Yeah. So you give it a 5. I'd
Easily.
probably give it about a 4.5. Was what I
Fair enough.
gave it on first time watch. But I'd like to
Yeah.
see it again. One more note is that I think something that helps like make it feel like a movie is the fact that it's shot on film, and obviously everything back then
Mm-hmm.
was. But I'd love to see it projected on film. That would be amazing. But it
Oof,
has like a really
yeah.
nice, it has nice cinematography. It has a really good look
Mm-hmm.
to it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like it feels like a movie, even though it's very untraditional compared to other movies. But I think if somebody made something like this today, like if somebody like shot it on like an iPhone, something similar, it might be
Mm-hmm.
harder to accept as a movie. But yeah, I felt like this had the perfect like it had a really great structure and the perfect like composition, and yeah, everything was really good. And also I love the 70s, and even just seeing 70s style and like her wandering through like a mall, not a mall, but just
Mm-hmm.
like when she's going down the escalator into these
Mm-hmm.
shops and just seeing like 70s like design everywhere. That was just nice to see. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a great film in terms of like the technical elements. I definitely agree.
Mhm.
It's strong. I think it's something that people who are able to carve out the time for it should give it. And if possible, people should try to watch it all the way through in one go because it really builds on itself. Yeah, I'm glad you were able to make the time for it too, and I'm glad you liked it. This has been so nice
Yeah, thank you.
chatting about it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it was a great watch. And yeah, I think
for
that's
sure.
everything I've got. But yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
being here, guys. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Drew.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.